Let's go ahead and get to it. Chapter 15. This will be one chapter in this unit and will take us about 2 weeks to get through. So the cardiovascular system is this big muscle located right in your mediastinum called the heart, and its blood vessels that are associated with them. And the purpose of the heart, it's a muscle, and like any muscle, it's used to move something, and the heart is used to move blood. The blood vessels transport blood throughout the body, and here's what you want to make a note of. Arteries always move blood away. Arteries move blood away from the heart. Veins bring blood back to the heart. So even you might write it real big right here in your notes. Arteries away from the heart, veins back to the heart. And between those arteries and veins are these tiny, tiny microscopic tubing called capillaries. And that's where the diffusion occurs and the osmosis occurs. And it's between the arteries and veins. And this is how those cells that you are breathing for get the oxygen, and how those cells that you're eating for gets the nutrients, and also how those cells get rid of their own waste. There are two closed circuits in the cardiovascular system. When they mean closed circuits, that means that the blood doesn't mix with the body fluid. For example, like a grasshopper has an open cardiovascular system, an open circuit, and so it's not as efficient. And we've evolved two circuits. The pulmonary circuit, pulmonary always means lungs, and the systemic circuit, which are the systems besides the lungs of the body. So the pulmonary circuit is this series of tubes coming and going from the heart to the lungs, and their job is to carry blood that has been quote unquote used and is now oxygen poor, take it from the heart to the lungs to drop off any CO2 in that blood and pick up oxygen. And then it takes it back to the heart. So that it's a short trip. The pulmonary circuit is heart, lungs, back to heart, lungs, back to heart, lung. And so not very far distance. Systemic circuit, on the other hand, is a little trickier because it's all the systems of the body. So the nervous system, so the brain, the kidneys, the muscles of the legs and arm, all the muscles, right? So all the systems. And we just oxygenated the blood in the pulmonary circuit. And so now we're going to take that oxygenated blood, that oxygen-rich blood, and move it to all the body cells in the systems. And those systems will take that oxygen and nutrients and release waste in the form of CO2 and other things. And we'll take that waste back to the heart, where then we can send it to the pulmonary circuit, where it releases that CO2 waste and picks up oxygen again, and we would just repeat. Now the left side is the larger side of the heart, and I'll show you the muscle, and that should make sense because which of these is going to need a stronger muscle? Well, I told you pulmonary circuit is a short distance and systemic circuit is long distance, both against gravity and with gravity. So this one's going to be harder to get blood to, and therefore the left side is thicker muscle to move all that blood to the systemic. The right side is the pulmonary. Okay, so let's kind of look at this, and this is really important. You want to learn this. So like I said, this left side of the heart, remember anatomical position, you are not thinking about your left side, you're thinking about this heart's left side. So the left side of the heart, look at the thickness of the heart wall here compared to the thickness of the heart wall here. This has much more muscle, stronger pump. It's going to push blood where? To all the systems of the body. So this is in the systemic circuit. So let's start there. Blood is pushed, to the nervous system and the upper extremities, to the digestive system and all the lower extremities, and releases the nutrients and the oxygen in capillary beds. At the same time, it's picking up waste such as CO2 and other things and bringing it back with a vein, because arteries move blood away, veins move blood back to the heart. So this is actually a major vein called the vena cava. This would be the inferior vena cava. This would be the superior vena cava. So they're bringing blood back to this pulmonary circuit, right? Because we've already used the blood here in the capillaries to get oxygen and nutrients. Now it's got a lot of waste in it. So let's put it in the left side, and it's a smaller muscle here. It's still pumping, but just not as heavy or hard, because where are we going? We're going through an artery again, but we're just right here at the lungs, so not a long distance. Notice this artery is blue and this artery is red. Blue doesn't always mean veins, and red doesn't always mean arteries. What they're saying is they're coloring things blue because they're lower in oxygen than things in red that are oxygen rich. And I will tell you that the blue colors represent lower oxygen, but not oxygen depleted. So this whole idea that blood turns red when it hits oxygen, well, it always is hitting oxygen. There's oxygen in this blood, in this venous blood, and in this right side of the heart. Just not as much as in the other one. It's about 75% oxygen in the hemoglobin, and this is 100%. So there's the difference. So we take this lower oxygen blood that has waste in it, and it's a small pump through this pulmonary trunk to these pulmonary arteries. Why are they arteries? Because we're moving away from the heart, and we're going to the lungs. Now, this branch turns into 2 pulmonary arteries, just like the aorta turns into a number of arteries. So we're going left and right side of the lungs, where we drop off the waste and pick up more oxygen, and we're coming back in a series of veins. So these are pulmonary veins. You've got 2 for each side. And now, what did we do here? We picked up oxygen. So we need to go to the left side of the heart and pump it to the rest of the body. And we're just repeating this series. It flows very well. So take some time and trace that back. Know what happens in the capillary beds at the lungs. Know what happens at the capillary beds of the systems. So let's just review that one more time. What's happening at the lungs? Well, CO2 is being released and oxygen is being picked up. What's happening at these capillary beds? Diffusion of oxygen into the cells and diffusion of oxygen out of the cells back into the blood to be released as we exhale. More on that later. Where does this gas exchange always occur? In capillary beds. And the capillary beds are associated with alveoli, these air sacs in the lungs. Very, very thin membranes here because we want this diffusion to happen very quickly. And I think that's pretty much all of that. So I would never ask you how big the heart is and what's its average size, but you do need to know it's located in the thoracic cavity in a place called the mediastinum. It's right behind your sternum, and it is in the thoracic cavity, which is always above the diaphragm, and it's right nestled near the lungs. That broad base, the top is the base. It starts at about the second rib, and the apex points slightly to the left, and its apex ends at the 5th intercostal space. Intercostal between rib. So this is the 5th space between ribs. And it does have a double pump, like we mentioned, and it's divided into left and right halves. So here's that aorta, here's that pulmonary trunk I talked about. This is going to split off into pulmonary arteries. This is going to branch off into arteries we'll name later. You can even see some of the heart's coronary arteries and veins on the outside actually feeding the heart, kind of a different system we'll talk about in a little bit. But for each side you have an atrium and a ventricle. And so this is the left ventricle and this is the right ventricle. And this left ventricle, while you can't see much of it, it is thicker muscled. And so it's got a big pump and it's going to push that blood right here. You can't see, it's going behind this way into the aorta and then to the rest of the body. This side, the right ventricle, is going to be a smaller squeeze, but it's going to get that blood into the pulmonary trunk, into the lungs. Auricles are these little, they kind of look like ears to me. They allow the atria to expand. And this is the situation of the heart and where it's located. So let's talk about the coverings of the heart and the walls of the heart. The covering of the heart, or the pericardium, is also called the pericardial sac, and it has a series of membranes associated with it. It covers over the heart and the proximal ends of the large blood vessels. And it includes on the most outside, so most superficial, is the fibrous pericardium. Peri means around, cardi is heart. Fibrous things are usually really tough. Sorry, I had to drink some water and I have ice in the way. Sorry for the slurp. Right below that, right deep to that fibrous pericardium, you have parietal pericardium. Now, parietal and visceral should be very familiar to you if you've already had Anatomy 1. And if you haven't had Anatomy 1, you're in the wrong class, okay? Parietal and visceral are serous membranes that line cavities in the body. And the parietal is going to be on the cavity, and the visceral is going to be on the organ itself, no matter if you're talking about the lungs or the intestines, or in this case, the heart. And serous membranes actually fold the pericardium, and the parietal and the visceral pericardium is really all the same serous membrane. And I'll show you a picture of that in a minute. So parietal pericardium is going to, and you can add this to your notes, it's going to line the space of that mediastinum, the cavity that the heart is found in. The visceral pericardium lays attached to the surface of the heart. And it is also called the epicardium because it is where? Right on top. Epi means above, right above the heart. And the space between the parietal and the visceral pericardium is called the pericardial cavity. So you have some space between these two folds, and usually we're going to find some fluids in there to keep these two tissues from rubbing together and prevent friction. So we got our right lung and our left lung, and here's the diaphragm, that muscle. So this is thoracic cavity, and this is the mediastinum. And if you zoom in on the heart, you can see it's got this pericardial sac, this pericardium around it. And it kind of covers some of these vessels that are entering into the heart, but doesn't cover all of the vessel. And so when you zoom in, you can see on the most outside right here is this fibrous pericardium. And then you have this serous membrane. This would be parietal because it's lining the cavity. And then it folds on itself, and now this side of the serous membrane, this piece, is touching the heart. So this is the visceral pericardium. So parietal, visceral, and then in between, the pericardial space. And then this is actually part of the heart. So that is the pericardium or pericardial sac, the fibrous pericardium, the visceral, the parietal, and the space between. And visceral is the one attached to the heart, and parietal. So I didn't do those in any kind of order, but those are the pericardium that make up the pericardial sac. The wall of the heart is made of that visceral pericardium. We said it's also called the epicardium and the myocardium. Myo means middle or muscle, and then endo means inside. So we have the outside, the inside, or the middle, and the very inside lining. So let's look at that. So we have this endocardium membrane. It's epithelium. We have this myocardial muscle tissue. And then you have your epicardium, also called the visceral pericardium. And the visceral folds to form the parietal pericardium. And what's on the outside of parietal pericardium? The tough fibrous pericardium. And here is some of that information and what it's made of and what it does. So we mentioned that the heart has these chambers called atrium, ventricles, and the auricles are the flap-like projections. And blood always enters from a vein, right? Because veins bring blood back to the heart. So veins lead to atria, atria lead to ventricles, and ventricles pump blood into arteries to send blood away from the heart. So you have a right atrium, you have a right ventricle, you have a left atrium and a left ventricle. The right atrium is getting blood from the systemic circuit. If you'll remember from this picture back here, let me go all the way back. Here's our left atrium. It's getting blood from the systemic circuit. Where does the blood go to next? It goes to the left ventricle. So if the question asks, where does blood come from? Where does the left ventricle receive blood from? Well, it came from the left atrium. So it flows into that from atrium to ventricle and then through arteries, in this case pulmonary arteries. If you look at the left side, the blood is coming in to the left atrium from the pulmonary circuit, goes to the left ventricle, and then that pumps to arteries, to the systemic circuit. So let's look back at that in words. Right atrium gets blood from systemic circuit, sends the blood to the right ventricle. The right ventricle pumps to the lungs. The lungs oxygenate the blood and take it back to the heart, where it goes into the left atrium from the pulmonary veins. This left atrium is going to squeeze. These are pumps too. They pump, the atria squeeze the blood into the ventricles below them. It's not just gravity. Gravity helps, but the blood is squeezed from the atrium into the ventricle. And then the left ventricle is that big squeeze because we're going to pump that oxygenated blood to the systemic circuit. And so here are some valves of the heart, and you want to know these and where they're located. And there's 4 valves of the heart that you need to know. The tricuspid valve is also called the right atrioventricular valve because it is between the atrium and the ventricle on the right side. The pulmonary valve is what leads to the pulmonary circuit. The mitral valve, also called bicuspid. So right bicuspid here. Mitral valve is on the left side of the atrioventricular, between the atrium and the ventricles. So you need to memorize which side is tricuspid and which side is bicuspid, and their names based on these cusps that hold the heartstrings, or that heartstrings hold. So the way I do this is tricuspid is 3, bicuspid is 2. So you wrote bicuspid here, I hope. And most people, this is a higher number, are right-handed. If you can come up with a better way to memorize this, find your way. But tricuspid is on the right side, bicuspid is on the left side. And then pulmonary valve's easy. Once you pass the pulmonary valve, you're in the pulmonary circuit, and once you pass the aortic valve, you're in the systemic circuit. And so I do want to show those here with you for just a second. So we're on the right side, and here's that tricuspid valve. And so what happens is when this right atrium squeezes blood down here into the right ventricle, and this right ventricle squeezes, the pressure snaps this valve shut. It's like a one-way door, and forces the blood through the aorta. And how's it going? What is it going through? Another valve. So every time you have a squeeze, we're going through a valve. Atria squeeze, we're going through the tricuspid. Ventricle squeeze, we're going through the this is the pulmonary valve. We're leading to the lungs, right? Because this is the right side of the heart. So this is the pulmonary valve. And what is that pulmonary valve doing? Preventing blood from flowing back into this ventricle. Why? Because we're about to squeeze more blood in there from the atria. We don't want blood coming back in from any arteries. We want blood coming to ventricles just from the atria. And so, one more time, squeezing the blood from the right atrium through the tricuspid to the right ventricle. Right ventricle squeezes blood through the pulmonary valve. On the left side, here's the left atrium. So the left atrium has just gotten blood from these pulmonary veins. You can see where the blood's being dumped. This is high oxygen blood. We squeeze this atrium through the bicuspid. When this big, thick-walled left ventricle squeezes, that forces this valve shut and will go through the aortic valve. You can see it better right here. So when this atria squeezes, we go into the ventricle. When this left ventricle squeezes, we go through the aortic valve. And where's this going? To the rest of the body. And what does this valve do? Well, it keeps blood from dropping back into the ventricle because we're about to fill it up with blood that the atria just received from the lungs. Okay, so there's some other structures associated with the heart. The inter means between, atrial, between the atrium, septum. So this is the piece of membrane that separates. Let's see, are they showing this here? Not very well. I'm going back to picture, sorry. Okay, so it would be this septum here in between the atria. So a separation, septum. And then this is the septum between the ventricles. So let's go back to all those vocabulary words. Interatrial septum is the tissue separating the atria. The interventricular septum separates the left and right ventricles. The superior and inferior vena cava we've already mentioned. It's a vena cava. It's a major vein, so we're bringing blood back to the heart. We already learned the tricuspid valve separates right atrium from left. The pulmonary semilunar valve or pulmonary valve leads to the pulmonary trunk or the whole pulmonary circuit. The bicuspid valve or mitral valve separates left and right, left and atrium and left ventricle, The aortic semilunar valve leads to the aorta. So that's what prevents blood from flowing back into the left ventricle. And then the words, these words might be new to you. Chordae tendineae, you probably heard them called heartstrings. Maybe you've heard the saying, someone's been pulling on my heartstrings. These are the strings that actually attach the cusps of the tricuspid and bicuspid to the muscles in the wall of the heart. They're called papillary muscles. And then so we know that there is pulmonary trunk that leads to pulmonary arteries, but there's actually 2 veins for each lung bringing blood back to the heart. And so that's why you have a total of 4 pulmonary veins bringing blood back to the heart to eventually pump to the rest of the body. And so there's those 1, 2, 3, 4 pulmonary veins bringing blood. There would be 2 openings here also to dump blood into this left side. Left atria squeezes, moves through the bicuspid into the left ventricle. Left ventricle squeezes. These cusps, this valve shuts, so blood can't go back the wrong way. It must go through this aortic valve into the aorta and branch into arteries that lead to the systems of the body. The superior and the inferior vena cava are bringing blood back from those systems of the body and dumps blood here into the right atrium. And the atrium squeezes, moves blood through the tricuspid. And you can see you can't see it well, but it's like 1, 2, 3 cusp, and this only has 2. But tricuspid blood moves past it. This ventricle squeezes, the valve shuts and forces blood through the pulmonary valve back to the lungs. We have not talked about the opening of the coronary sinus yet. This is the whole coming from the inferior vena cava. This is from the superior vena cava. Okay, I think that's everything. Here's that thin interatrial septum and the thicker interventricular septum. Septum is just separate. You have a nasal septum. It's what separates your two nostrils. So here's the tricuspid, an actual picture if you cut into the heart, and you can see these strings holding the cusps, these flaps, if you will, that make up the valve. And those are the chordae tendineae. And then this muscle on the inside of the heart is the papillary muscles. So we'll talk just briefly about the skeleton of the heart. There are rings of dense connective tissue that surround the origins of the pulmonary trunk and the aorta and the orifices between, or the spaces between the atria and the ventricle. And they just provide attachments for these valves and these muscle fibers, and prevent excess dilation of the heart chambers during contraction. You don't want it to close, too much. These rings make up the skeleton of the heart. And so you can kind of see these rings when you're looking at the heart. All right, so this is written word of blood flow through the heart, lungs, and tissues. I've said this a few times, so I'm just going to not read this to you. I'm going to let you read it to yourself and make sure that you know where blood is going and where blood came from, what valves it has moved through. Quite a few questions on that test. So here is a picture you can trace that has the arrows, arteries moving away. So here's aorta moving to systems, capillary beds, diffusion occurs, vena cava brings blood back to the right side of the heart through the tricuspid valve, into the right ventricle, a pump through the pulmonary branch, the pulmonary arteries to the lungs, to the alveoli capillaries for diffusion, get oxygen, bring it back through one of the 4 pulmonary veins into the left atria, squeeze the left atria through the bicuspid. I think I said bicuspid here. This is tricuspid. Bicuspid here, and then a big squeeze of the left ventricle to the aorta and the rest of the body. And then you can see here where oxygen-rich blood becomes oxygen poor, and it's all in these systemic capillaries. So if you're in the upper body tissue, if you're actually feeding the heart itself, which we haven't talked about yet, and then the lower body. So this is all going to give oxygen to those cells of the body and pick up waste, and then we're bringing the waste back to the heart and to the lungs to pick up oxygen and drop off CO2, back to the heart, and then back to the body. And it just circles around. I really love this picture. And so here's the systemic circuit, here's the pulmonary circuit, here's the right side of the heart and the left side of the heart. So let's talk about the coronary arteries and how the heart itself gets oxygen. Even though there's a lot of blood inside, and my dog is snoring, so if you hear something, that's what it is. But there's a lot of blood inside the heart, and the oxygen is not diffusing through that endocardial tissue. We've got to get blood and oxygen to the heart muscle itself, but not from the inside. It's actually from the outside. And so there are what's called left and right coronary arteries that leave the heart and come back to the heart and feed it. And the coronary arteries are actually the first 2 branches of the aorta. So think about how important the aorta is. It's supplying oxygen to the whole body, and the first 2 branches are going to the heart itself. Think about how much heart work your heart does and when it does it, like all the time, right? So it needs oxygen all the time. So the branches of the right coronary artery are called the posterior interventricular artery, And so it supplies the posterior ventricles, and then the right marginal branch, which supplies oxygen to the right atrium and ventricle. The branches of the left coronary artery are called the circumflex branch, and it supplies blood to the left atrium and ventricle, and the anterior interventricular artery, or left anterior descending, supplies walls to the ventricles. Notice we're giving blood to both atrium and ventricles because both are going to contract and both need oxygen to do that work. The cardiac veins drain blood from that myocardium. Remember that middle layer of the heart wall that's mainly muscle? Well, the cardiac veins drain the blood from that and lead to what's called the coronary sinus. Now, sinuses are spaces, so this is an enlarged vein and that drains into the right atrium. So let's see if we can see some of this. Okay, so we have the right coronary artery coming here, the opening of the left coronary artery here, and then all of this coming right off the aorta. So you can see this is the first two branches coming off. And then you can see how they're feeding the heart from the outside because blood is not going to allow oxygen to diffuse from the inside. And wherever there's arteries, we're going to see veins associated. So here's these coronary veins picking up the used blood from the heart and going to dump it into the coronary sinus and into the right atrium. So here's how blood is supplied to the heart. From the aorta, you have your right coronary artery and your left, your first two branches off the aorta, and then what they branch into and what they feed. Don't focus on this stuff too much. Okay, this is not as important for us, but you do need to know that the aorta branches into these parts, and we are in the coronary system. So we're not sending blood to the lungs, we're not sending blood to all the systems, we're sending blood to the heart itself. And that's why when you hear about coronary artery disease, it's a big deal because these arteries are giving oxygen to the ventricles and atria that help move blood to the rest of the body. So we want them nice and clean and clear. So aorta splits here, feeds the heart, and then returns the blood through cardiac veins to the coronary sinus and into the right atrium. And that is where we're going to take a break.